Hello everybody, thanks for joining me again. This week I'm back down at the coast. In fact, I've come back to Froward Point. Last week, if you watched my video, it was overcast and I didn't think I was going to get many decent photographs. However, when I got them home and started editing, I actually got a lot more than I thought. In fact, some of the photographs I didn't really see until I got home. So this week I've decided to come back to the same place, but instead of staying at the battery, I'm going to walk along the coastal path to Coleton Fishacre. Only a short section of the southwest coastal path, but as you can see from the scene behind me, plenty to photograph. And this week I'm going to try and take my time and maybe explain a bit more about what I'm doing as I go along. Okay, let's see what I can find. Well, I've come down as close as I dare to the sea, close to these rocks and these crashing waves. I'm just below the last searchlight outpost here at the battery. Let me show you. So that's where I am, just at the mouth of the River Dart. So I'll show you the composition I'm trying to get in the back of camera. I've got a polarising filter on. If I turn it, you can see the effect that has. There's more reflection on the water, and I can tone that down. And what I want to get is some contrast between the darker sea and the crashing waves. And then what I also want to do is slow the exposure down enough to get some nice effects in the waves. Well, I'm going to experiment with that. So I started by setting the ISO to 50, which is as low as the camera will go. And because I wanted a deep depths of field with everything in focus, I set the aperture to f11. And then playing around with the shutter speed, I ended up at 2 seconds to get the exposure correct. I was hoping this would give quite a nice effect in the crashing waves. I also focused manually about a third of the way into the shot, as you can see, and hoping at f11 that this would get most things in focus. So this was the shot I ended up with. I quite liked the way the rocks lead in from the bottom and almost reflected in the clouds that come in from the top left. Could have done with more action in the waves, but not a bad start to the day. Well, I'm sure you can see what I'm trying to get. I I think that's a really nice image. So I'm 1/80th of a second. I'll have to play with the f-stop and probably have to put the ISO up a bit. Let's see. If I turn the f-stop up a bit, so say f11, too dark. So ISO, well, let's go up to ISO 250 and see what that looks like. Well, because I was holding the camera, I was also at 80th of a second shutter speed. But I quite like the way the bunker frames the horizon. And it was a nice, almost sunrise. I've got more shots like this at the end of the video, so stay tuned to the end. Okay, I don't know what that will turn out like, but let's move on to the next spot, see what else I can find. I'm a little bit further along the path, and as you can see I'm closer to the Mewstone, and I can get a classic shot of the whole rock in the frame, so I'm going to try that. The light's not great at the moment, but you never know, the sun might peek through. I'm going to try two different things. I'm going to try a short and quite a long exposure. For the long exposure I'll have to put an ND filter on. I'm just going to turn the ISO down a bit. Let's make ISO 100. And at f11 that means I'm going to slow the shutter speed down a little bit more, 1/4 of a second, 1/5 of a second, without blowing out the highlights. Okay. Focus in on the rock. Just make sure I'm focused in on the rock. About there. 2-second timer. And let's see what that looks like. Well, what I'm trying to show is the difference between a short exposure, this was 1/15th of a second, and a long exposure, say 10 to 30 seconds. As you can see with this shot, there's plenty of detail, everything's in focus, and the sea is as you'd expect how you see it. And quite a nice shot. Well, I've put a 10-stop ND filter on to try and smooth the water out as much as possible, and I'm in luck that the sun is starting to shine on the sea on the horizon, so with any luck I might get a half decent shot. Well, I'm going to focus in on the rock again. The sun, or the light, is starting to come across the water. I'm at 30-second exposure. I'm going to turn the f-stop down to f11. Looks really dark in the back of camera, but I know from experience that's going to give me just about what I want. There we go, f11. And wait for a minute for it to process. And as you can see, this long exposure shot creates something completely different, something that looks almost painted. The rocks are obviously still sharp, but anything that's moving is now smooth and more blurred, and almost a painted look to it, which I quite like. Well, I've moved along the path a little bit more so that I've now got the sun directly behind the Mewstone. Keeps coming and going, so I'll have to bide my time. And as you can hear, it's still a little bit windy. So when taking a 30-second exposure, I'll just have to take my time, take a few shots. I find it helps just to stop and look, not rush too much. Good idea to have a snack, have an apple or something. So I'm actually at 25 seconds, f11, ISO 100, focused in on the rocks, and I've got a 10-stop ND filter on. Let's see what that looks like. Well, as the sun was peeping through the clouds, you can see this gave me a lot more contrast and gave me more of a silhouette shot. I purposely didn't bring out any detail in the shadows, and I've toned down the saturation slightly to give this almost like moonlight shot. Just come across a bunch of gannets fishing off the end of this headland. So I've put the long lens on, and I've got settings of a 5/100th of a second with an auto ISO, and I think f6.3, which is wide as this lens will go when it's zoomed all the way in. I could speed it up a bit to a 1,000th of a second, but 500 should do, as long as I follow the birds. Let's see if I can get any shots of them diving into the water. I think I've come as far as I'm going to along the path. Not quite made it to Coleton Fishacre, it's just round this first headland here. But I've stopped here just to take a photograph of the coastline, another long exposure. We'll see what we can make of that. So I've got the 10-stop ND filter on again. Not sure if you can see that in camera if I brighten it up a bit. There we go. I'm going to try a landscape shot first and then portrait. So let's try whether I can get away with f8, 25 seconds. I'm focused in on those rocks in the middle. Let's try that. Well, I'll include the landscape shot at the end of the video, but here's the portrait image, which I preferred. I like the fact that there's some foreground and you can follow the coast essing up towards the horizon. Well, I thought that last photograph might be my last, but walking back to the battery, I've seen this formation of rocks which I quite like the colours. There's some oranges and yellows and even some purpley colours in the undergrowth above. So I'm going to try that again, another long exposure, and see how we get on. So let's set the camera up. Well, I wanted another long exposure, so I put the 10-stop filter on again, and then zoomed in slightly to 33mm to frame it nicely. Set it to f8, ISO 50, and that gave me a shutter speed of 20 seconds. And what I wanted to do was, like the other shots, try and get some blurred waves around the base of the cliffs. So I think that worked. I think from a composition point of view, your eye is led from the waves in the bottom left hand corner initially up to the lone tree, and then along the coastline, which in this case goes all the way around to almost start point. Well, I've almost made it back to the car. I'm just going through this section with these pine trees, which is lovely. And the path splits here. You can go down to the bottom of the battery along the coast and wind your way up, or there's a shortcut straight to the car park, so I'm heading that way back. But this stretch is really nice. There's still plenty of coastline to see. Anyway, I think I'll call it a day. Thanks for watching again. It did turn into more of a video about long exposures, so apologies for that. Hope you enjoyed the walk and I've inspired you to get out a bit. All the photos I've taken today I'll put on my website, and I'll leave a link in the description below. If you did like the video, then don't forget to subscribe to my channel and give me a like, and I'll see you again next week. But for now, cheerio.